have a little something to read to you as we begin or continue and begin the lesson this morning. This is a quote from a medical expert, and it says that whatever this is, I'm not going to tell you yet, it's a secret, okay? But whatever this is, the hormones that this dumps into your brain, it says, have been linked to shrinking brain mass, lowering your IQ, being prone to heart disease, cancer, premature aging, predicting marital problems. By the way, what a way to begin a sermon, all right? But it goes on. Family dysfunction and clinical depression, and making seniors more likely to develop dementia and Alzheimer's. What do you think it is that dumps those hormones into your brain? Well, you might have already started doing that when I read that. The rest of the quote, or the part I didn't read, is it says the stress hormones that worry dumps into your brain. And like I said, don't start worrying on me about worry, okay, and what it's doing to your brain. But that's the medical field. That's what the medical field says. It's one way of summarizing what medicine says, or the medical field rather, says about worry and anxiety, about allowing stress to become something where that stresses us in a deeper way that we then would label with terms like worry and anxiety. Now let's take out our Bibles together and let's read a section from Mark chapter 4. If you picked up a copy of the handout, you might have noticed that opening question. What happened, or what happens to the seed that falls among the thorns or among the weeds? As we think today about the stranglehold, well, I'm clicking and it's not clicking on my end. All right, but let's look at Mark chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. This is where Jesus explains what we sometimes call the parable of the sower, the parable of the seed, the parable of the sower. It's about a man that goes out and he sows these seeds among different types of terrain, different soils, and then there are different results. Different things happen with the seed. Well, this is after the disciples have asked for an explanation. They don't quite understand what's the spiritual meaning of this story, this parable. And in the middle of explaining that, in Mark chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, we read this. And others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word. These are people that have hearts that are receptive. They listen to God's word. They listen to the gospel, at least, about Jesus. But then this happens. Verse 19, but the cares, or might we say this morning, the worries, the anxieties of the world, and the deceitfulness of riches, not just that, but for our purposes, we are looking at that. Let's finish the verse. And the desire for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Jesus describes, at least in part, worry or the cares of this world as like weeds or thorns that surround a young budding seed, a plant, and chokes it from its receiving proper nutrients and being productive and fruitful. It's interesting that if you look at the background of our English word for worry, and we're not going to get super deep in etymology and word study this morning, but you can just recognize with me that we get our word worry from the idea of strangling or choking something. So biblically speaking, and even just in our own language, worry, anxiety has this nature about it that it wants to get a stranglehold on us. It strangles our minds. It chokes us. You ever felt like that? There's some literal application to that. Some people get so anxious, or maybe I should just say some of us as humanity. I'm not trying to pick on people that maybe this is more of a problem for them than others. I hope you understand that. But are you familiar with panic attacks? People have those, right? They get so anxious and so apprehensive about something that they literally start choking. They literally can't breathe, or at least are struggling to breathe, and have other immediately noticeable physical health issues because they get so strangled mentally and emotionally by worry. Let's just say this morning that anxiety and worry, spiritually, medically, physically, in every way, it's a dangerous problem. Worry left unchecked can turn into depression, anger, can turn into apathy where you just don't care anymore because you've been bitten by caring too much. So let's take a few minutes this morning and look at 3 biblical principles that hopefully can aid us in fighting back against worry. I'm not going to say this morning that can help us to completely overcome worry in this lifetime. At least for some of us, that's not even possible, I don't think. It's going to be something we're going to have to struggle with. But let's keep worry from getting a stranglehold as it tries to strangle us. If you're in Mark chapter 4, let's turn in our Bibles now to Matthew chapter 6 as we think together about the idea of being focused. Focus and prioritize. That's category number 1 this morning. Learn, develop, focus, and learn to prioritize where you put your emphasis in life. Matthew chapter 6, we're going to begin reading at verse 24 this morning as we look at the idea of the question of focus. Where is my focus? Now, this is not always the case, but it is sometimes the case, for sure, that anxiety and worry, when it's a real rooted problem in my heart, there's another problem in my heart. It's that I'm too caught up, I'm too focused and attached to earthly things. It's even that some other times there's a materialistic mindset that can easily breed along with that an anxious mind. Look at Matthew 6, verse 24. We don't always keep 24 in this context, but before Jesus specifically addresses, starting in verse 25, the problem of worry, and we'll spend a decent amount of time, the rest of this chapter, a whole paragraph on it, he says this prior to that, Matthew 6:24. No one can serve 2 masters, for he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or your version might say mammon, which is a way of referring to possessions, and as it is in the ESV, to money. So Matthew 6:24 is be careful of what you're devoted to, be careful of what you make yourself enslaved to, or you allow yourself to be enslaved to. Make sure you're loyal to God. That's where your focus is. Money is not. And then he writes this, or he says this, that Matthew records rather, therefore. So because of that, I tell you, do not be, and there's your word, anxious. Or stop being anxious about your life. More than that, he says, here's what I mean by that, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. For their context, that clothing part, what you're going to put on your body is more basic. Today, we probably would relate that more to fashion and status. But either way, he's saying be careful that you don't get focused on these things. Now, Jesus is not saying that they don't matter at all. Like, don't make sure you put food on the table for your family, or you can just quit your job because, hey, I'm not going to worry about food. But he is saying, be careful that your mind doesn't get too focused there. It doesn't become something that is all-consuming, where that's all your life is about. You ever seen somebody like that, where their life is about these things, and all they do is eat and sleep and work, and it's, they just got to make sure they've got enough. Then he writes this. He says, is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Jesus wants us to see the bigger picture that, yes, these, what we might label sometimes the necessities of life, they matter, but how much? Isn't there more to life? He's saying, isn't there more purpose and more meaning and fulfillment in life than just these things that are just things? And then back up. I have verse 20. We'll go ahead and read 19 through 21 for this morning of Matthew 6. Here's more of this previous context. And he's still talking about things and money, oddly enough. Matthew 6:19, he says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. We could change the question and say, where's my focus? What is my treasure? What's my real treasure in this life? And then, if you're in Matthew 6:21, let's drop down to verse 33. This is one that's often quoted, but I do wonder sometimes if it is sometimes neglected, or if the fact is neglected sometimes, that this is in the same discussion about worry, about priority, seeking. Verse 33, he says, but seek first. And this but is in contrast to those that are seeking the things we mentioned earlier, where their whole life is about finding and getting things. But seek first instead the kingdom, the reign of God, and His righteousness. And all these things will be added to you. Jesus is asking me today, He's asking us today, what are you really after in your life? If I'm chasing after the wrong things, or if I'm chasing after, we could simply, things, that might be part of the reason I find myself worried so much. And then let's consider a story before we move on. Let's look at Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 38. The last portion here of the 10th chapter of Luke. I called it the story of two sisters. There's the tale of two sons and the tale of two cities. One of those is in the Bible, isn't it? Well, this is the tale of two sisters. And then this is not necessarily a good and bad sister kind of story. It's a lesson learned kind of story. Let's read it together. Luke chapter 10, 38 through 42. It says, now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. And that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, if you isolated this from this context, wouldn't you say that somebody that's serving and helping to take care of people and being a good hostess, I mean, wouldn't you say that was pretty good? And you might say, well, maybe she shouldn't have complained. I mean, you could look at it as complaining, but you could look at it as she's legitimately trying to get her sister to help her out. But the Lord, the next verse, He answered her, verse 41, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. You think that could be me this morning? I've got a lot of things to take care of, a lot of bills to pay, a lot of problems to fix, relationships. And we can make a whole list, a host of things. Are we worried about many things and trouble? And sometimes it seems like we try to get really busy or stay really busy because if we're really busy, we won't have time to even worry. Ever tried that one? And yet, worry, in many ways, is the ultimate multitasking, isn't it? And isn't it often that the busier I am and the more distracted I am by life, the more anxious I am at the same time? And then Jesus continues and says, but one thing is necessary. Talk about necessities. This passage might be a wake-up call for us to re-examine what really is necessary. There are things in life that are urgent, that I need to take care of, sure. But then there are things in life that are really important. I can get those out of balance sometimes. Jesus says there's only one thing that's really you have to do. Now, I don't think Jesus is telling you that you don't need to wash your dishes or you don't need to serve people in your home. That would miss the point. But the point is that those things are going to be there. What really matters, or what really should matter to me, focus, priority, is Jesus, His Word. Finish the chapter. He says, one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, and it will not, he says, be taken away from her. One of the lessons to learn, perhaps this morning to relearn, is to focus and prioritize my mental activity as well as my actual time. Might help me with anxiety. But then, let's turn in our Bibles now to the letter that Paul writes to those in Philippi. Philippians chapter 4. We're going to begin reading in verse 6 from this letter. I don't know that these next two passages, like Matthew 6, are that big of a surprise. But there's a reason for it. And I know that the idea of giving it to God, right? Just give it to God, that has become somewhat trite and cliche. But I don't think it's one of those we need to throw away because of that. I believe that there's a reason it's become that way. Because it is so true, but at the same time, we need to be careful that it's not just something we say or something that sounds good to put on the refrigerator, that we actually do it. Give it to God. Get close to the God of peace. One way of summarizing this whole section, Philippians 4, 6 through 9, is if you get close to the God of peace, and this, I'm not just saying this to be trite either, then you will find your way to having the peace of God. Do you see those words in this text? The peace of God, and then the God of peace. Let's read it together. Philippians 4, verse 6. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything. Note how inclusive this is. All inclusive. He says, don't worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, give it to God. With thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and this is the result, you could call it a promise, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding. This isn't just some psychological parlor trick or just understand how you think and just think this way. It's a bit more than that. He says that it will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Jesus is involved here. And then in verse 8, he gives us a whole list of things to think about. And then in verse 9, drop down there for a moment, he says, what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things. And you could start with what he just mentioned. Philippians 4, 6 through 8. Practice these things, and then here it is, and the God of peace will be with you. I heard the story of a man. It was actually he and his wife. They decided they were going to put this into practice in this way. They would, anytime they started to worry about something, they'd write it down on a little slip of paper, and then they had this jar, and they wrote on the outside the jar, giving it to God. And so they'd pray about it, and they'd put it in the jar, and the idea was you wouldn't think about it after. Just leave it with God and move on. And then, of course, he said that it was, and they put it up real high on a high shelf in their house. And then anytime you thought about that and started worrying about it at least, then you had to pull the jar down and go through and find whatever it was you had written down. Of course, he said that it was kind of disappointing how many times he found himself reaching up and pulling down the jar because he'd worried about something. And that's the thing, right? That's part of the reason it's just this cliche thing, and then nobody actually does it. Because it's a different story when you're not just saying, yeah, I'm giving it to God. It's a different story when you take it to God in prayer and you pray about it, and then maybe for a few minutes, maybe for that afternoon or whatever it is, you're good. But then you start worrying about it again. That's, what do we say, where the rubber meets the road? That's the trick, isn't it? Is to actually surrender it, give it to God. And then maybe have the commitment that says, when I start thinking about it later, that I learn to tell myself no. Say, no, I've already given that to God. I've already prayed about it. Maybe that'd be a good time to pray about it again, okay? But that belongs to God. God's going to take care of that. It's not my problem anymore. And then look at 1 Peter chapter 5. Let's turn over to 1 Peter chapter 5. We're going to read verse 6 and 7 here. It's a very similar instruction, so there's some overlap. We'll try not to overdo it. But in 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter encourages us mainly to do two things here. I mean, in Philippians 4, you've got several things. If you back up in the context, even more. But here's two things Peter says to do. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. So, humility. And it's almost as if there's humility that is a prerequisite for this. Could this be part of the answer, part of the solution to how to really do this? Could it be? I mean, is it really possible that there are times when it is my ego that keeps me from letting go of whatever it is I'm anxious about? Because I'm going to solve this. I'm going to take care of my own self. It's possible that I'm too big sometimes to come humbly and in a small way and actually say, here you go, God. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Holy Spirit has Peter start with humility. And then he says, verse 7, it's usually a part of the same sentence in most translations, casting all your anxieties on Him, because He cares for you. So in Philippians 4, it's you don't be anxious about anything, but take that to God in prayer. Pray about everything that bothers you, and you'll have the peace of God from the God of peace. Now it's have the humility to surrender even my ego and my cares, because I know He cares. See that wordplay there? Sometimes it's translated that way. It isn't the same word, so there's that. But there's a play there, I think. You give your cares, the things that are on your mind, the things that are causing you to wring your hands, at least mentally, if not physically, and you open your hands in prayer to God, and you give it to God. That's where that question comes in. Am I willing to surrender both my ego, that's the word there, my ego, and then my problems to God. The Bible says, give it to God. And then lastly this morning, we see the idea of focus and prioritize. We see giving it to God. But lastly this morning, we need to embrace realities. And I have for us three, we'll do these briefly and close, three different realities, and they're each from different standpoints. Here's the first one. Let's go. The first one is to remember who my Father is. I know that's not the best grammar, but we'll work with it. To not forget that, and we've already addressed this to an extent. We just read from 1 Peter where he says, because he cares for you. Here, you could also go back to Matthew chapter 6 and read, and starting in verse 26, where Jesus says, look at how God cares for the birds, how God clothes the grass. Look at his care in general, and then look at you, the crown of his creation. Remember who your Father is. My Father in heaven, he cares about me, Matthew 6 also says. And then Matthew 6 also says, about verse 32, that he knows what I need. So it's not just that he cares, but he doesn't really know me. He can't really help me. I mean, there are people like that, right, that sincerely care about us, but they don't really know what to do to help us. And I've been there, right? This person's hurting, but I don't know what to do. God's both of those. Embrace that reality this morning. Let it really sink in. It has, let it re-sink deeper. Don't let the thorns keep that from sinking in. Say, this is who my Father is. Regardless of anyone or anything else in life, I've got him. He's got me. But then reality number two to embrace is that worry is pointless. It's useless. What's the old saying? That worry is like a rocking chair. A lot of movement, a lot of energy is exerted, but you don't get anywhere. You don't do anything. And that's not to put down people that like to sit in rocking chairs and rock their troubles away. There might be something therapeutic about that. I don't know. But Jesus even says it here. What does he say in Matthew 6? Who of you by worrying can change anything about their life? Depending on translations, either add to their stature, add an inch or to your height, or it might be add length to your actual life. And if anything, we've already noted that worrying too much, if anything, that's going to shorten your longevity, not the other way around. And you could just ask this morning, what has ever been accomplished? What have you ever done that was productive or good by worrying about it? I don't mean sitting down and problem solving or troubleshooting or weighing pros and cons about a decision. I don't mean thinking about something and being concerned about something. I mean just worrying about it, being anxious about it, fretting about it. And maybe you've seen that list. I'm not going to take time even to read it this morning, but there's a list, the statistics of the percentage of things that either will never happen or you have no control over, or all these different things we worry about. And it's like 8% are things we can actually do something about, but worrying about it is not going to do something about it, right? It's giving a big shadow, the old proverb, to a small thing. A shadow then that comes over our hearts. Embrace that. But it never touches reality. Worry doesn't. The only thing it changes is us. And our attitude, our mood, all of that. And then Matthew 6, verse 34. Let's read this one together as we wrap up. Matthew 6, verse 34, the last verse of this discussion. Here's Jesus' bottom line. Matthew 6, verse 34. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow. How many of us have done that? worried about what's going to happen tomorrow or what's going to happen next week when I have whatever's coming up, or the unknown. For tomorrow will be anxious for itself. And I wouldn't be surprised if Jesus said that with a bit of a smirk. But then he says, sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And that sounds an awful lot like a saying that we have. So I put it that way in my notes, that the idea here is to embrace the current reality, to live in the moment, to live one day at a time. Now, there are calls biblically for us to have hope and to, yes, look to the future and things like that, but not to worry about the future, for sure. And to say, I'm going to take care of what I can take care of. I'm going to do what I need to do today. And there's these two attitudes. One attitude, you get up in the morning and it's like, oh, it's another day. Okay. Got to go to work. Got to pay the bills. I got to do whatever. And then there's the attitude of like Psalm 118. And this is sometimes only applied to Sundays. I'm not sure that's correct. It actually has a messianic context about Jesus' day. But this is the day that the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad. Yeah. What difference would that make? I got up every day and I said, this is the day God has given me. Yeah, there's going to be problems. Some I might already know about. Some my brain's trying to imagine already. I'm going to rejoice in a beautiful day. Even regardless of the weather and all that, it's a beautiful day because God made it. It's a reality I need to embrace. So focus and prioritize. Know what's important and what might just be urgent and not so important after all. Give it to God. Pray about it. When you start worrying about it, just ask, have I prayed about this? Good question. And then embrace some realities today. Some things that are true, regardless of anything else. On the very back of the handout, I put this I will statement for this week. This week, I will keep my mind set on Jesus. We live in a world that is constantly changing, not always for the better. We live in a world where people disappoint us, where things break, where things wear out, including our own bodies. But there is one who is the same. What is it? Hebrews 13:8, the same yesterday, today, and always. There is one. That if I fix my mind on Him, this isn't just psychology either. It's more, I trust in Him. And here you could take this from Isaiah 26:3 if you'd like. The promise, even in passages like Isaiah 26:3, there to God's people, I think it's easily extended to God's people today, that He, if I keep my mind set on Jesus, He will keep me in perfect peace. I don't care who you are. That promise, that's something to hold dearly. That would be something that wakes us up and says, yeah, I want to find out about that. So the invitation this morning is your invitation. Not to just stand and sing a song, but to say, I want to focus on Jesus today. What that looks like for you today is going to be different for each of us. Yes, as always, we extend the opportunity for someone to come and be baptized into Jesus. If you haven't done that. But having done that, Jesus says, therefore, because of me, because you trust in me, don't be anxious. Have my peace. Let's stand together and sing.